Whether it's Dungeons and Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, Mutants and Masterminds, or whatever TTRPG you play, we often play them with other people. And in the case of players and game masters, there are sometimes red flags we all exhibit when we're either getting into the hobby, we're already introduced into the hobby, or you might be a veteran. Note, this does not mean that GMs cannot be toxic. However, as you saw in today's video title, I'm going to be talking about red flags, specifically player red flags. So, I want to focus on the player side of habits and things we as both game masters and players should be aware of when joining, starting, or continuing your next TTRPG. So, today I'll be discussing 5 player red flags that we need to be aware of at our table. And by the way, if you're liking this content, feel free to like and subscribe. Anyhow, let's get into it. Red flag number 1, the lone wolf. Like I've said before, and I'll say again, tabletop role-playing games are usually a cooperative game that rely on teamwork and collaboration. The problem with the lone wolf is a player that refuses to work with the rest of the group and insists on going off on their own. This character insists that they can do everything by themselves, and they don't see the need of having the party help them in any decision. And I think this kind of player red flag comes from popular media to the edgy, distant, and lone wolf character archetype you might see in a lot of media. You know, think of Mandalorian or any kind of post-apocalyptic main character. But why is it an issue? The lone wolf archetype functions well in movies because the story is built around a singular badass. This is not the case for TTRPGs. Many games are built with multiple player characters in mind. All these characters deserve the spotlight. A player who plays a lone wolf kinda disregards that the focus will not always be on them. Secondly, a lone wolf in RPGs benefits from going through the growth of warming up to the players. If that's not part of the equation as a player character, and you don't recognize that, then there will be an issue. Ultimately, I think the problem with a lone wolf is that it can cause tension and disrupt the flow of the game because you can't, as a GM, focus on one player alone. Everyone deserves a bit of spotlight, and maybe some players might want a little bit more and some players want a bit less, but it's important that you spread your attention to all of the players at the table, virtual or otherwise, and for the players at the table, it's important to check in with your fellow players to make sure they aren't isolating themselves or playing a lone wolf archetype that's harmful to the player and GM ecosystem at your table. As for red flag number 2, this one is about safety tools. And I think it's specifically if anyone says safety tools are pointless or unnecessary or not needed at all. Safety tools, I think, are your best friend. These tools, tricks, or tips are used so that we can all have a more enjoyable and emotionally responsible time at the table. Safety tools allow us to air out things we do or do not want to see in our TTRPG. They allow us to be more emotionally responsible for what we say, do, and furthermore roleplay at our tables. And not all topics are for all people. Not everyone wants to discuss a specific topic at the table or talk about a specific thing. If it's agreed upon, you don't talk about it. Role-playing games can and are an investment in yourself and the characters you play. The characters you play are an embodiment of who you are or a refraction of who you are. And that means there will be things you do and do not want to do in your RPG with those characters. So, if someone's saying safety tools are pointless, or they don't like using safety tools, it's concerning because it means they don't respect your boundaries, they don't respect what you want in the game, and they might not respect what you don't want to see in your RPG. For instance, maybe you don't want to see depictions of home invasions or children being attacked or harmed. That kind of material makes you uncomfortable or triggers up some really bad memories and just makes you generally anxious. If your players or game master go into graphic detail about any of that information you clearly outlined early on, then it's a clear break of boundary and it's also really rude. So, safety tools are just a way to treat others with kindness and respect like we all deserve at the table. It's a way for strangers, friends, family members, and loved ones to feel like they are allowed to say when something is bothering them. And let me be clear, safety tools might not be necessary for your table if you're very familiar with the people at your table, virtual or otherwise. they might not be necessary in those specific cases. But what if you're at a convention, or what if you're people you've never talked to before or you've never met? Safety tools, I think, are a quick and fast way to learn what each of the players' boundaries are while not being awkward about it. In fact, I think safety tools are like condoms, protection, prep, and unions. If someone says they aren't needed, then they are in fact vital. Number 3, we're going to be moving on from a little bit less on safety and more on violence. And I'm talking specifically about the Murder Hobo. The Murder Hobo is a player who solves every problem with violence. While combat is certainly a part of Dungeons & Dragons and many other TTRPGs, it's important to remember that there are often other solutions to problems that don't involve killing everyone on sight. But where exactly does the concept or idea of a Murder Hobo come from? Or where does it originate from players' intentions and how they resolve problems within their game? A Murder Hobo might appear because there hasn't been a clear expectation set upon the player. The player might have a disconnect, not realizing that this is not a video game. NPCs react realistically. So just randomly killing someone for no logical or reasonable fashion is going to result in major consequences depending on the world. Or it could be the fact that the GM isn't presenting encounters where murdering someone outright isn't always going to be the solution. Or maybe the player doesn't realize there are alternative solutions to encounters. Also, it could be mechanics where some games focus on combat, so murder hobos are more likely to appear because one of the main facets of a game might be combat. I think a murder hobo isn't inherently bad. Like all these other red flags, these aren't inherently bad, but it's important that we take a little bit of a perspective and look at them. Because a murder hobo is nothing more than just a player who realizes that maybe killing everything is the solution, but it's up to the GM and players to say, hey, no, your character can do so many other things than simply attack. And I think the biggest thing we need to acknowledge is that a murder hobo is the result of player expectations not being talked about clearly, as well as player boundaries with the GM. As for red flag number 4, we're talking about the Disruptor. The Disruptor is a player who intentionally tries to derail the game or cause chaos for the sake of being disrupted and not for the sake of creating a shared story together. This can include things like intentionally ignoring the plot, intentionally causing conflict in the group, or intentionally trying to make the game less fun for everyone else. Some examples of that could look like pushing the GM, or saying really uncomfortable or unnerving things to GM, or questioning everything that another player does. It could also look like backseat driving or complaining about every little thing that happens to the game when things don't go your way. Or one thing I have seen is comparing your game master or players to other game master or players that these folks don't know. Ultimately, the Disruptor's intent isn't to have fun. Their intent is to destroy or derail the game because they gain more enjoyment from seeing how frustrating playing with them can be or pushing people's buttons than actually playing the TTRPG. And number 5, the final red flag, is the GM antagonizer. These are the players that do not listen to directions you as the game master or dungeon master have given. They don't follow your directions for maybe the Google application you sent out. They don't listen when you ask them to send you your character sheet. They don't listen to any directions when they're on their phone, or they're generally just an antagonistic personality at the table. They are the player that decides to go against the rules that you've already established, the boundaries that you've already given to the others, or generally will not listen to you and will push back on you on every rule, decision, and or conversation at your table. They challenge you in every ruling and don't trust your judgment, and or might even gaslight you, telling you that you're crazy for making this ruling. Maybe they even compare you to another GM, which, by the way, don't do. It generally kind of sucks. For instance, maybe you're playing a fantasy RPG, and this one player keeps constantly questioning your ruling. You as a GM say, hey, in this dungeon crawling game, no one has dark vision. The player character says, well, in my other dungeon crawling game, our GM allows us to have dark vision, so I should have dark vision. First off, no. Second off, you're an asshole if you do that. Here's the thing. There's a key difference between slight confusion and concern. whereas the players have genuine and legit criticism. And as a game master, you should be open to criticism. And also, for players in mind who are watching this, you should also be open to criticism. Constructive criticism, where we're all getting better, is important because GMing and playing in TTRPGs is a skill. But if you're being antagonistic, you're being rude, you're making character judgments, you're comparing unfairly against another GM, or you're generally just being antagonistic to the game master, then that's not fun. That will drain the fun of a TTRPG faster than anything, and no one should ever have to experience that. And GMs, if someone's doing that, kick their ass out of the table and get to finding yourself a new player. And those are my 5 player red flags that I think you should try to avoid. Now, am I saying that if a player exhibits these red flags, they are inherently a bad player and should be immediately kicked out? No. While I don't have much patience for someone who's antagonistic or an asshole or disruptive in my table, I still think it's important to have a conversation with the player, pull them off to the side, and ask them why they're doing the things they're doing. Because oftentimes, I don't think we're ever intentionally trying to be hurtful. In fact, I usually think people are doing it by accident, by bad habits they've learned over the years, or by just mistake. So when in doubt, just have the conversation with your players. And players, if you do see these red flags in yourself or in other players, help your GM. Tell your GM how you feel, and tell your GM if you're not having fun. Communication goes a long way when you're playing in a game that is a social game. What do you think? Am I wrong? Do I just sound like I'm talking out of my ass? Or does something I say make some sense? Let me know down below in the comment section. And as always, I'm your average everyday queer host, Blurry Disposition. Hope you all have an awesome day. And if you feel like it, be sure to support my Patreon or Ko-fi if you have the funds to do so. Anyhow, ciao!